Hello, Laura Trevelyan here again, and today we're doing the big one. We're doing the big man. We're doing Patrick White. Or more particularly, we are looking at things that I learnt as a writer from reading Patrick White. Now, I've read nearly all his major novels. I've read nearly all his novels. I'm currently reading The Fringe of Leaves, which I'm not enjoying as much. I'm enjoying the first part, but I think that there's problematic stuff by the time we get to Fraser Island, but that's bit by the by. But we're looking at Patrick White today. So these are things that I've learnt from reading things like The Tree of Man, Voss, The Vivisector, The Eye of the Storm, The Solid Mandala, The Riders in the Chariot. So the really big ones, the really, really big, The Twineborn Affair, The Aunt's Story. I've read all of those. So Patrick White is very little read. I read a statistic that in this century, so from 2000 to about, at the time it was talking about it at 2012, 2013, under 500 copies of The Tree of Man had been sold in Australia. So he is very much less read. And I think part of this is he has this awesome, terrifying reputation, but also part of it is he's a little impenetrable at times, and people just don't consider him someone who they want to read. He doesn't talk to us. Actually, he does talk to us. He does talk to us. Try the books. Try the books, because he really does speak to us, and he speaks in a very clear voice. He just tells us stuff we don't always want to hear. That's a problem. So, lessons I have learnt from Patrick White. And now, I write literary fiction, so these are not applicable to everyone. These are lessons that I have learnt to work with my genre of fiction. You will have to read Patrick White to work out what you need to learn from him. But these are things that I personally learnt from Patrick White. The first one is, do not introduce obvious plot points for the first third to the first half of the novel. This is something that I believe Patrick White learnt from Russian writers, because his novels are actually not so influenced by English writers as by Russian writers. And Russian writers, of which I've also read a lot, do not introduce obvious plot, especially a writer like Dostoevsky does not introduce obvious plot for at least a third to half of the novel. It's a very interesting way of writing. So I learnt that from Patrick White. Characters need inner lives. That's the second thing. How many characters have you read or tried to write where they just seem a bit too surface, a bit too not enough? Well, that's generally because they don't have an inner life. And that inner life is really important to getting and believing in your characters. So creating an inner life for your characters gives them that third dimension that they may be lacking. And we're not talking about so-and-so thought this, so-and-so thought that, which is just an extension of dialogue. It's actually creating a really strong inner life. Okay, create all your characters separately and introduce them to the reader separately before you introduce them to each other. So instead of, which I have seen in a lot of people's writing when they're trying to work out how to make something work, is that we see characters and they put them all together to begin with. And so it's just a crowd of people and you can't remember who's who and what's what. Something Patrick White does is he will, certainly of his main characters, his major characters, he will introduce them on their own before introducing them to other characters. So with the exception of the twins in The Solid Mandala, he does introduce these characters very individually, but then those twins are quite inseparable, which is sort of the point of them. Okay, so it really helps the reader connect with your characters if they get to meet them one-on-one, as it were. Okay, the environment and objects both establish mood and character. So the environment that you create, just as Elizabeth Harrower did in my last film, the environment that you create and objects that the characters own are not random. They are helping to establish character. So this is quite an important quality. For instance, Amy Parker's, the nutmeg grater that Amy Parker gets at her wedding, and she loses it, and it's found at the end of the book somewhere in the garden after she has had a bit of an affair with the travelling salesman. Is really symbolic of that character. It's a certain degree of her wanting something exotic, wanting something different, wanting more than perhaps she can get from Stan. And so that using those sorts of items in a totemic way can be very, very important. Something that I really learnt from Patrick White. Next thing is the weather is important. The weather is important. The weather is actually important across all Australian writing. You will not find another country's writing that uses weather to such an extent. Really astonishing how much they will use the weather. I've never seen any other country that uses the weather like this. The Eye of the Storm is all about a hurricane, or at least a central part of it is about a hurricane. So that is really using that weather as a central and very important part of this world. But the weather is important across the whole of the work. You see big weather events either influencing or impacting characters. Weather, we are a country obsessed by the weather. Okay, the grotesque is in the detail, and use it. Grotesqueness is usable and it helps with character. So, and it's in the detail. It's not, you don't create a grotesque, a gigantic grotesque. It's something is a little bit off. It's particular to Patrick White. Patrick White is very particular about using the grotesque. He uses it extraordinarily effectively. And I'm thinking here of the two murderous old ladies in The Riders in the Chariot. The grotesque is used there. He also has a big thing about teeth that he uses in that grotesqueness. He like a lot of well-to-do Australians in his time period, had false teeth. A lot of well-to-do Australians decided that they would have all their teeth out and have false teeth because it saved on dentistry. It was a fashion. It was a very particular fashion. And teeth reoccur again and again and again in Patrick White's, and in quite grotesque manner in Patrick White's writing. Cruelty and ugliness have their place, and don't be afraid to use them. So cruelty and ugliness, like the grotesque, they have their place and they're very usable and very effective if you use them judiciously. You cannot use them across the board. That's very, very off-putting. But there are places where you can use it judiciously and it's unbelievably effective. And second last one is humour is vital. Humour is black humour, straight up humour is interwoven in Australian writing like just it's integral. You can't not have humour. You need humour in Australian writing. And finally, Australia is vast and majestic, and her literature should recognise this and respond to it. We are not little. We can write big stories. We can write big, and we can deserve our own place in the world. We don't have to apologise for who we are as Australians. So those are lessons I have learned from Patrick White. I do encourage you to read Patrick White yourself. I personally would say start with The Tree of Man. It's the most accessible. Voss is really good. But definitely The Tree of Man. The Vivisector is quite interesting, especially with a lot of the backstory around the Vivisector. Start with The Tree of Man. It's a great place to start. Don't start where I started with the art story. Once you've read the art story, you can read anything, but start with The Tree of Man if you want something more readable. Anyway, next time I see you, I will be talking to you about the Australian Gothic. And I'll see you later. Bye.